From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with podcasts.
The end of the day is you have to create something that is worth your listeners' time to consume it. And that doesn't mean if you're doing a 60-minute podcast that you spend 65 minutes on it per week. You have to put work in.
That's Rob Walch, VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn, the world's largest podcast network. Hi and welcome to episode 16. I'm Nick Schildberger. Rob Walch is one of the biggest names in podcasting, and we're delighted to speak to him about his thoughts on what makes a good podcast and a special insight into branded podcasts. But first, as always, I'm joined by my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore.
Hello, Nick. Big news out of Melbourne this month. Very first time podcasting ads have been put on our iconic trams in Melbourne. A Melbourne podcasting network, Nearly Media, splashed out on some money this month for two of their shows, The Debrief with Dan O'Neill and The Clappers. And we'll speak with Courtney Carthy from Nearly Media next episode about that and other things. But to me, you know, that's a turning point in the podcasting industry in this country. Advertising on a tram in Melbourne is as iconic for Melbourne as, say, the billboards in New York's Times Square is for New York.
Perhaps a slight stretch, but we can go with that.
I can do a bit of hyperbole, that's all right. But the other thing too, it adds a bit of extra spice to the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry. It's hard to separate which city's leading in terms of podcasting these days. In Sydney, you got Whooshka, Audible, the headquarters to Audible in Australia, Acast, Macquarie Media, Nova, the ABC's Ozpod event, of course. Melbourne, though, we're catching up and perhaps we're on par now. We've got Omni Studio, Audio Boom, headquarters here in Melbourne for Australia, Nearly Media, Earbuds, the Wheeler Centre, and of course, you know, B Media Production. Very interesting times ahead with the podcasting landscape. But if you're not in Melbourne or Sydney, you probably think, you know, who cares?
Anyway, we need to get to our feature interview today. Tell me, Chris, who did you speak to?
Rob Walch. He's the VP of Podcaster Relations at Libsyn. Now, Libsyn is a major podcast hosting platform, around 35,000 shows altogether, 62 million monthly audience members, 4.6 billion podcast downloads, the ridiculous numbers. Now, Rob himself is one of the world's most influential people in podcasting. He's consulted with Governor Bill Richardson in the States, Tim Ferriss and Jack Welch, among others, on podcasting. He's a sought-after commentator and keynote speaker, and he was one of the main attractions at this year's podcast movement, the biggest podcast conference in the United States. And here's the interview. Rob Walch, apparently your talk at the Podcast Movement 2017 event in Anaheim, California was one of the best attended and one of the most talked about. For the life of me, I can't find any video or transcription of what you said, but I know it went for an hour, plus an hour of questions. Can you share a little of what you said on some of the biggest marketing myths going around about podcasting?
Right, and this was my session. It's titled, Yes, That Marketing Advice for Your Podcast is BS. You know, I went over a lot of different myths. The first one up was the myth that most people just listen to NPR or pro podcasts. And I said, no, it's not even close to the truth. You know, that most podcast listeners are listening to indie podcasters. Even if you went and looked at the top charts, most of the shows that are in the top charts are indie podcasters. You know, in the U.S., the top 200 list on August 7th was 56.5% indies versus just 22% for public media or 14% for procasters or 7.5% for big media. So it was one, just to bring people to the reality that no, indie podcasters still make up the majority of podcasting. Definitely 98% of the podcasts are indie, but that even the majority of the downloads are also from the indie podcasters. So that was one myth I wanted to bust right off the bat. The other one that I was like, one I bust was that SoundCloud is a viable podcast host. I was like, no, it's not. It's not a viable podcast host. And I went over how they almost went out of business in August and that it's just a music business that happens to have this podcast hobby on the side and that nobody in their right mind hosts their podcast on SoundCloud as their primary host. And if you do, you best move off because, again, they almost went out of business back this summer, and it's just not a matter of if they'll go out of business, it's just a matter of when. I think they've got enough money to get them to maybe the end of 2018.
Why do you think some of these myths perpetuate?
Just people reporting things. I mean, the other one big myth was the ideal length of an episode is 22 minutes. I hate that. You see these articles written by people that came out of radio and they try to tell you, oh, the ideal length of a podcast is 22 minutes. And that has no basis of reality at all. Matter of fact, when you look at the top shows in iTunes, it's quite different. What we looked at back in January this year, we looked at every episode that was released in January and measured at the end of February. And of those episodes that were 100,000 downloads or more, 84% of those shows were 51 minutes or longer. Less than 10% were 30 minutes or less. And matter of fact, there was more shows that were 2 hours and longer than there were 30 minutes or less that were getting 100,000 downloads.
Where does the 22 minutes come into then? How did they come to that figure?
Because it come out of radio. Is people writing these articles come out of radio, and that's what they know. And that 22 minutes is how much time they actually spend talking in a half hour, with commercial breaks taken out of the content. So what really, when you listen on the radio, what you're listening to is 22 minutes of content for every half hour of radio play. And so they think that's where it is. And they'll talk about, oh, the average commute time is this. And they come up with all kinds of reasons why this is the right length. And when you look at the most popular shows, that's not the reality at all. Joe Rogan, a couple hours per episode. Even Hamish and Andy in Australia, they're long episodes. Hardcore History is 6 hours an episode. So no basis in reality at all, that 22 minutes. Now, what I also said was, look, don't be long just to be long. That's not good either. But don't be short because you think it's going to make you popular. The real answer is there is no ideal length. It's whatever you feel comfortable and have content to talk for. As Dave Jackson will say, there's no such thing as too long. They're just too boring.
That goes with any medium too. Now, on the Libsyn platform, you have, I mean, you can tell me the numbers, but tens of thousands of podcasts now. Is that right?
Yeah, well over 35,000. We started the year at 35,000, well beyond that. And we are the largest podcast host when you go by number of downloads. Last year in 2016, globally, we had over 25% of all the downloads in iTunes. No one else was even 10% that I'm aware of.
What do you think makes a good podcast?
It's simple. Giving the listener value for their time they spent listening to you. And what is that value? Oh, that's the tough question. It can be something funny if they want a comedy podcast, it makes them laugh. It can be educational, so you educate them. If you can figure out how to educate and make them laugh, then you have a success. But it has to be where you're providing them something of greater value than something else they could do during that period of time. There's entertainment value too. There's the true crime podcast that people get into the stories and get invested in it. But the end of the day is you have to create something that is worth your listeners' time to consume it. And that doesn't mean if you're doing a 60-minute podcast that you spend 65 minutes on it per week. You look at Aaron Mahnke from Lore, 25-minute long episode. He spends 35 hours every other week getting that 25 minutes out. You have to put work in.
Well, having a good podcast and being talented is one thing, Rob, but what's your advice for podcasters or anyone looking to acquire a bigger audience? How do they get people to listen and to discover their podcast?
You want to be everywhere. You have to look at where podcasts are being consumed and understand there's a lot of different places that people can find a podcast. Clearly, number one is iTunes. You got to be in iTunes. As a matter of fact, I always say, if you don't have an RSS feed and you're not in iTunes, you are not a podcast. So you need to be in iTunes because Overcast and Shifty Jelly Pocket Cast and Podcast Addict all scrape from the iTunes directory. So you're not in any of them if you're not in iTunes. You want to be in Stitcher. You want to be in the different music services. You want to be in Google Play Music and iHeartRadio and TuneIn and Spotify if you can get in, and Alexa soon to get in. So you want to be in those types of services, and you want to have your own smartphone app. A lot of people don't understand the value of having your own smartphone app. It's like a business not having a website. If you're a podcaster and you don't have your own smartphone app, there are over 2 billion people globally that download apps every month. There's only about 100 million people that download podcasts every month. Having an app on a subject that you're covering in your niche, having it out in the app stores is a way for your show to get discovered. So have an app, be everywhere. Make sure you can convert your audio to video and get it up into YouTube. Get your content out everywhere you possibly can.
Well, if those are some of the things that you should be doing, what are some of the biggest fails that you've seen in podcasting?
The biggest fails usually come down to people just thinking that they can go hire some marketing or go to some webinar and get in a webinar that's going to teach them how to market their podcast. There is no quick fix. I think the biggest fails are people trying to do a quick fix. Hiring somebody. I had someone the other day that said, I hired this person to help market my podcast, and they told me I should have 1,200 downloads, but I'm only seeing 50. Yeah, because we filtered out all the garbage. There's people that try to spam and game the system. So the biggest fails are when people try to take shortcuts. There is no guaranteed audience growth. It just isn't.
Well, if we can turn to brands, and for brands looking to advertise in a podcast, how do they do it? What kind of ad is best? A host-read ad? Is it better at the beginning of a podcast? What are your thoughts on this?
A host-read ad is always the best ad because it's less jarring to the audience. It comes from the host, and it's someone they're used to and trust, and it's harder for people to skip through a host-read ad because they're not really sure, is he in the ad read now or is he in the episode? But if it's a third party, it's easy to say, oh, nope, not done yet, not done yet, not done yet. Oh, there we go. Now we're done. So having a host-read ad for logistical reasons is best. Having it in the middle of the episode is best because now a lot of people's smartphones are in their pocket or purse, so it's harder for them to skip through it. So having it in the mid-roll, not right at the beginning, is a good, effective way to work for the advertiser. And then I think the most important thing is bullet points. If you're a brand advertiser, and do bullet points, don't do a script. Because if you try to script it, you're never going to capture the voice of the host, and it's going to come off sounding unnatural. Give some bullet points. Tell the producer what you want them to talk about. If you have product that you can send them product. Let them get familiar with it. And you'll be surprised. Podcasters can do a really good job. Does that mean all of them will? No. There's some podcasters that do really absolutely horrible jobs, ad reads. But the ones that do advertising and stay in advertising and do it over and over, they've learned how to do it well. And they understand that there's an art to it.
Well, what's your take on branded podcasts? There are a few which work well, even The Feed itself, which is Libsyn's own podcast, which I listen to, which is brilliant. There's Hootcast for Hootsuite. That's another great example. And GE has spent enormous amounts of money on its audio strategy. What makes a good branded podcast?
I don't like the GE one as a podcast, and I'll tell you why. All GE one did was say, hey, GE can spend a lot of money on audio that has nothing to do with their product or anything else. Fine, if they want to do that and they want to spend it, but it's not as effective as the Hootsuite one or the podcast that was just launched by AdAge Ad Lib podcast. Those are the types of podcasts where you're kind of getting inside the product, where people identify with that product, and now you have a podcast that takes them to the next level. Those are the branded podcasts that do well. GE slapping their name on something they didn't produce, they just wrote a big check, reminds people that they didn't produce it and they just wrote a big check. Is that the message they're trying to send out? Hey, GE, we're back, we can spend money again? Okay, maybe that's what GE was going for. But it's not the same as, say, a Consumer Reports podcast or even HBO's Bill Maher's podcast. There are podcasts that are done by big companies that are done well and have been doing them for many, many years. And people didn't take notice because they were just making good content and the brand was coming along. Where GE made notice was they spent a ton of money and had someone else make it for them. Great. So they have a ton of money. That's not a repeatable business model or option for a lot of people out there. But a Hootsuite or a Salesforce or AdAge can do great content, much, much more effective content long-term for a return on investment than GE did because they're making content that's relevant to their core audience. And I think if you're doing a branded podcast and you're doing it for your core audience and you do it yourself, and maybe with some help, but doing most of the heavy lifting yourself and creating the content, that's great. But if you're going to sign a check to somebody and then say, okay, and you have no say in the content, that's what the deal was with GE. They have no say in the content. Wow. I just don't agree with that. I don't see that as a branded podcast. They just really advertised on somebody else's podcast. That's all they did.
So a good branded podcast would be what? To educate consumers that are using the product or want to use a product?
engage with your audience, engage with your customer base when they have an opportunity to listen but not do anything else. I mean, people forget there's more time in the day to listen to audio than there is anything else. Businesses that understand that and create content that educates, engages, and interacts with their audience while they're driving, having them listening to this something about their marketplace and builds that brand while they're listening to it. That's a very successful podcast. You don't have to spend a ton of money. You don't have to pay someone else to do it. If you got someone talented at your company that knows your product line or the market you're in, it doesn't take much to do it.
Well, moving along, we've noticed an incredible surge of podcast awareness among the general public here in Australia, but we still seem to be miles away from the level of consumption in the United States. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in podcasting where you are, not just in the last couple of years, but even in the last 12 months?
Well, I mean, in the last few years, the biggest change was just the consumption going to mobile. It switched over in the last 5 years where it was like 70% computer to now it's 86% mobile. So there's been a big shift in the last 5 years from the computer to the mobile consumption. So that's been the biggest thing. And the best part about it was computer consumption actually didn't decline. It stayed the same as far as the total number. It's just that all the growth in podcasting was on mobile. And per the last 12 months, it just has been a solidification of that. When we see the next change, it'll be when Google steps up to the plate and makes a native app in Android, because what we've seen is the consumption on mobile is about a 5-to-1 ratio iOS to Android. And if you figure there's over a 5-to-1 ratio of Android devices to iOS devices in the world, the numbers work out to over a 30-to-1 consumption ratio for the typical iOS device versus the typical Android device when it comes to podcast consumption. So really the only thing that's going to really move the needle in podcasting is Google making a native podcast app available on Android from day one. In there, it's pre-installed, it has a directory, they do similar things to what Apple's doing. That's what I'm excited about, seeing something like that coming down the line. Because I think Google's finally getting to the point where they realize their ecosystem in Android is missing this huge piece, and that's podcasts.
And are they on the way to doing that, do you think?
I hope. Don't know. They were at Podcast Movement, walking around, asking questions, so that was a very promising sign. So hopefully they took the message back, which I think everyone was pretty clear, which was put a native player on Android. And I think that will really change things, especially outside the U.S. In the U.S., it's over 50%, or around 50% iOS to Android. So it's a pretty even split. Most countries outside the U.S. don't skew that way. Most countries skew heavy to Android. But, there are some very big podcasts in Australia. Hamish and Andy does phenomenal numbers in Australia. So there are some very big podcasts that are right up there with the biggest podcasts in the U.S. And the core audience for Hamish and Andy is almost all Australia.
Well, there's a lot more competition, not only among podcasters, Rob, but hosting platforms like Libsyn. How does Libsyn continue to stay as a leader in this market, and what's the future for Libsyn?
Well, we have always had a philosophy that we want to make it podcasting available to anyone. You don't have to know how to code. You don't need a WordPress site. All you need to do is know how to record an audio file, and then you can use us to distribute. We try to make the distribution the easiest part of it. Upload, add a title description, hit publish, and then get statistics back and be reliable. So when it's time to upload, the file uploads. When it's time to publish, the file gets out to everybody. So, I think that's where Libsyn's strengths have come in. We've seen a lot of people come over the years. They come in, try to have a free business model. We've always been a paid service. And the free business model just doesn't work. We've seen so many companies go out of business. So many go out of business over the years. One of them, somebody just, Opinion, announced they're going out of business at the end of this month. So it just doesn't work. Anchor is another example. They'll go out of business here. They haven't gone out yet, but they just got some money. But eventually Anchor will go out of business because they have no business model. And it's the same thing with SoundCloud. SoundCloud almost went out of business. They don't have a business model. So Libsyn has been able to stay around and survive because we have a business model, which means we can invest into our back end. We can give you the most reliable hosting. We can deliver any number of downloads you get. So our servers aren't going to go down no matter how popular your show is. And so that is where our advantage comes from. Going forward, we work with podcasters with one other goal in mind, is make sure you can get your podcast everywhere. So we've done deals in the past with Spotify, and we've done deals with iHeartRadio, and we've done deals with Google Play Music when they launched, and we're doing one right now with Alexa. And what we try to do is make sure it's easy to get as an indie podcaster out to all these other platforms. You don't have to be some big name in some big network or belong, to NBC or CBS or NPR to get access to all these other platforms. That if you're an indie podcaster and you come host with Libsyn, we put you on the same playing field as all the other guys out there. And that's important because I'm an indie podcaster and I want to be on the same playing field as all the other folks. And that I think is the best part about podcasting. There really is no advantage to being an NPR. Matter of fact, sometimes there's a disadvantage for being those folks because they're limited in what they can do. Whereas as an indie podcaster, you're free to do whatever you want, however you want to do it.
Well, Rob Walch, Libsyn's been around a long time, and it seems like it's going to be around a lot longer. Thank you very much for talking today. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much for having me on.
That was a good interview, Chris.
It was. However, I can't agree with his thoughts about GE and how their involvement with podcasting. I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing that a company is splashing a lot of money, even though they're not doing it themselves. But GE is not known as a media production company. If they've got the money and they want to be involved with it, what a great way to spend a lot on producers and a production team, audio engineers, to craft a story like The Message. I mean, without that money, that what I think was a wonderful podcast series may not have been produced.
Yeah, I agree. I think The Message, if it wasn't for Serial, The Message may have been the podcast that sort of everybody talks about as being the turning point in the industry. It was, right up there as a hugely downloaded podcast.
It's a big call, though.
It is a big call, but I'm sure GE will be grateful for the feedback.
But like any business, with any kind of entertainment, sponsorship for sporting events or television shows, the money comes from these big players in business, but they're not necessarily creating the entertainment. And so why not? Why not give it to a production house that can do it well, do it properly?
Yeah, I think Rob was comparing what GE have done to other brands like Hootsuite, or we've talked about Tinder before, and I think that it's probably unfair to brand them with the same brush. Because what Hootsuite have done is it is an engaging podcast designed for their customers. Whereas GE have decided, under what we now know they have an audio strategy, to produce highly entertaining content in an audio format. And they've had huge amounts of downloads. So I agree with you. I've enjoyed it. Millions of people around the world have enjoyed it. So I wouldn't want GE and other brands not to do that.
And what is a branded podcast? The term itself, it's semantics. I mean, we put labels on things, but it's great to be innovative when it comes to anything. But with audio content, it could be what GE's done. It could be an internal communication strategy. It could be a finite series like Janaea. It could be an ongoing podcast that just informs people of, updates on certain technology. So, everything's good.
Well, the word podcast is very generic, and perhaps branded podcast is becoming too generic to differentiate between what brands are doing.
Well, that's right. Another thing Rob talked about was having an app. I can understand how it could help with many businesses as a means of getting noticed, but I don't think everybody needs an app for every podcast. What are your thoughts?
Well, if I had an app for every single podcast that I currently have in my podcatchers, they wouldn't fit on my phone because I've got too many podcasts.
And too many apps.
But I did agree with Rob's point about getting your audio everywhere. And he even said including converting some of it to video for other social media. And again, if you can afford it and it fits your strategy to have an app, then sure, do it. But I don't agree with you have to have an app, because I think having an app for app's sake is a poor strategy. Apps can do more than just deliver audio too. I mean, you could, if you're a brand producing audio and you already have an app, then you can put your audio into that app. So there are different ways of doing it. I know at Libsyn they produce podcast-specific apps. So there's a range of different things you can do. And for the bigger brands that have the bigger budgets where an app fits, great. But I wouldn't say you have to start with an app just to do a podcast.
Agreed.
Now, for the 16th time in a row, we're going to discuss the ideal duration, aren't we, Chris?
Look, actually, one thing, I'm sceptical about any podcast that's more than 60 minutes, to be honest. And I've got no data to back up my thoughts here other than myself. I just look at my app and I balk at if anything's more than 60 minutes. Do I have the time or the inclination to bother checking it out? If something's 20 minutes, I'll give it a go and listen to the whole thing if I have got the time. But 60 minutes, I don't know, I'm sceptical. Nick.
And Rob went on to say that, I think it was in the quote at the very top of this episode, that don't spend 65 minutes to create a 60-minute podcast. So you've also got to keep that in mind, that it does take a lot longer to produce a high-quality podcast than the finished duration time. So if you set out to produce an hour and then that takes you 30 hours to produce, well, you might not have 30 hours. So sometimes the time you have to produce it will affect your finished duration time as well.
And it's so obvious. I think it was just the last episode, Nick. I said this, that it's so obvious that a podcast that hasn't been well prepared, it shows. There's rubbish. The rubbish that comes out of their mouths. Not like us, of course.
Well, before we start rubbishing on, perhaps that's enough for this episode. Do you agree?
Yes, so we'll end now. So that's it for episode 16 of Be Podcasting. So that you don't miss out on future episodes, why not subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, or wherever good podcasts are found. And if you found this valuable, we'd love you to leave a review and share it with others in the world of podcasting. For more about us, go to be.com.au. Of course, we've been helping brands of all sizes create audio to communicate their messages for more than 3 decades, and we'd love to discuss working with you. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.